So I'm Justin Bramwell. This is Fidget, which is a portable MP3 player device. It tries to do a emotionally driven MP3 player device rather than try and go towards current trends of touchscreen devices and over-the-air services. It tries to sort of bring back nostalgia and tactility back into portable music listening. So this project came about from looking and observing users and sort of listening to music on the tube in socially restrictive situations such as on the tube on the bus. And when they're listening to music, they sort of like to fidget around and play around with it. This is sort of like a user behaviour that sort of hasn't really been documented or sort of really explored as much as possible. So this project sort of looks at that and tries to sort of tap into why people do certain different actions, such as tapping around. And well, it's a fun project to sort of play around with, and it goes against sort of user expectations really. So this is the prototype. Isn't quite finished yet, but it's got the basic elements to it. So Fidget is a handheld sort of portable music device. You sort of hold it like this, and it has some various key switches. They're a bit sticky at the moment. Key switches on sort of the main areas of contact, and you sort of have it by your side in your hand all the time. It's not meant to be in the pocket. It doesn't really stand up. It's meant to be in your hand all the time, and so you sort of play around with it and play around with the key switches. And so as you're listening to music, you tap around, and this will sort of bring about other user features such as song and energy recognition. So if you had a really stressful day, you take Fidget out, you don't know what sort of, well, you know what sort of mood you're in, but you don't know what song you want. You sort of bash something out really quickly, and you choose like a heavy metal song, for example. If you want something fairly peaceful, you do something fairly, like a piano rhythm, and it will choose a song based on those sort of inputs. The stage I'm at with this project is that it's almost finished on the physical side of it, but on the electronic side of it, it's still got a bit of work to do. There's a screen and an MP3 module inside. It's just a case of getting it all to work together, sort of wiring up and make sure they all fit. And the interactive side as well, which sort of the coding and everything else in between it. So the screen and the graphics work, but the MP3 model needs a bit of work to sort of get it to become a fully interactive product. This prototype would be used to show show a graphic on the screen and to have music playback. And as well as this, it'll be all enclosed in sort of a fully functional aesthetic model, which is a very sort of challenging approach because you've either got to do the sort of electronic side of it as well as the aesthetic side of it and sort of fit it in at the same time. Sometimes you'll find that components won't fit, so you've had to work around and design around the electronics, which is something that's fairly challenging to do. In addition to coming up with a functional model and the aesthetic model and sort of combining it all together, I'm going to present it to users, and they're going to sort of fidget around with it and play around with it, because it's mostly the experience that's going to be the main sort of analytical factor of this project. Parts of the project that include electronic prototyping include a OLED screen, which is used to drive graphics and prompt the user into doing certain functions. There's an MP3 playback, which the user sort of plugs in their headphones and do song selection. There are also mechanical key switches involved with the product, which sort of aid the sort of experience of using it. It's very tactile. It's a very fun experience of using the product. And there's also sort of memory card and USB functionality as well, which sort of had to sort of work together to bring a whole product experience. I've spent about 20% of my time on this project on electronic prototyping, simply because other elements of the design, such as the interaction, the experience, and the overall form, sort of dictated much of the design decisions. Electronics, such as the MP3 playback, is a fairly recognisable thing for users, so it was sort of pushed back to a very late stage of the project. For the electronic prototyping, I'm using Arduino, which is an open source electronic prototyping platform, and through this I'm using the Nano board, which actually is a very small version of the prototyping board, which I'll be able to fit inside my functional model. From this, I'm able to connect up screens and card readers and the MP3 playback, and from this the Arduino is sending commands to the OLED screen, which is doing the actual graphics side of it. So it's not actually doing a lot of heavy processing, it's just sending basic commands which will be interpreted by the screen. One of my biggest challenges with this project was actually trying to source electronic components and libraries and trying to get them all to work together. I found it very difficult to try and find working versions, working models, and trying to get it to work with my specific version of the board. Too many times I found that things weren't dated on the internet and communities weren't very difficult to trawl through. It was a fairly traumatic experience. I made the most of using online communities and asking for help online, but the process was fairly lengthy of trying to get feedback and trying to get some answers instead of having an immediate response with someone physically working with my board. I've had to make a few sacrifices with the electronic prototyping of this project, because at the start I had this fully interactive product and fully interactive experience, but as time went on, features got cut due to component restrictions, and basic component sizes had to be cut out because they wouldn't fit into my functional model. So all these things sort of added up to a very basic, but fully, it does the basics of the actual product of turning on, displaying a graphic and playing MP3s, which is the main thing I want to sort of test with my users. So from the start of this project, I knew there was going to be an electronic side along the line, but I found it fairly difficult to try and source components and get them to work and trying to find the right components. But eventually I've managed to sort of trawl through all the various help and data sheets and documents and managed to get something to work with a screen on of it, which is always a very good thing to see something light up and present some animations. To make this process easier, particularly with the electronic prototyping side of it, I would have spent more time sort of in the early stages of the development to establish what components I needed and various sizes, so I could work my design around those components rather than sourcing the components at the very last stage and trying to get them to work. So prior to working on this project on the electronic prototyping side, I've had some basic experience with working with electronics, such as wiring speaking components. I make my own speakers and amplifiers, but most of that was through trial and error. It was a very fairly lengthy trial and error process. So this is the electronic side of Fidget. We have a Arduino Nano, which is a prototyping board driving this OLED screen. It's just sending basic commands, and the OLED screen is basically drawing colours and swipes, and it can draw basic shapes as well. It can display images from an internal memory card as well. And this is a MP3 unit which is taken from a MP3 player, which I've sort of taken apart, and all this will sort of fit inside the electronics of Fidget, and this should go on top.